This is Ideas Worth Exploring by Mark McDonald. There's a famous story on Reddit about a guy who goes to meet his girlfriend's parents for the first time, and they're having baked potatoes for dinner. During dinner, he decides to be funny and pretend not to know what a potato is. The parents don't understand that it's a joke, and they start getting frustrated and accuse him of lying, but he keeps insisting that he's never heard of a potato before. The situation becomes increasingly awkward, and the girlfriend's parents get really mad. This story is an example of the game of chicken, where each side has something to lose if they back down. If he admits he knows what a potato is, he loses face and comes across as a liar. But if they accept that he genuinely doesn't know what a potato is, they have to apologize for not believing him. The dinner ends on a sour note, and the father ends up kicking him out of the house. In the guy's own words, "Now in text messages I have been telling my girlfriend that I really don't know what a potato is. The only way I can ever get out of this is for them to buy that I don't know what a potato is. I wish I'd never started, but I can't go back. I think she'll break up with me anyway." This story highlights the absurdity and the high stakes of such a social game of chicken. If you ever encounter a situation where you think, who's going to give in first? It's probably a game of chicken. This is the dynamic that shaped the arms race of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. You've probably also seen it many times in personal arguments. People create situations where one of the players needs to give in or else both will face a disaster, like having your girlfriend break up with you because you won't admit that you know what a potato is. Today's episode is about the game of chicken and how to win it. To win at the game of chicken, sometimes the best move is not to play. But if you're forced to play, you need to be able to convince the other person that you won't be the first to give in. So it's important to understand how to send believable signals about your intentions. With that in mind, here's how this episode will be organized. First, we'll introduce the game of chicken, then talk about how to make strategic moves that change the game in your favor. Then explore a strategy called brinkmanship, where you put pressure on your opponent by increasing the risk of a mutually bad outcome. Finally, we'll transition to talking about signaling and how to send a credible signal of your intentions. I need to warn you that there is more politics in this episode than any other episode I've written so far, because so many interactions in politics are very similar to the game of chicken. Also, there will be a few examples of guns, nuclear war, and other types of violence, so be warned. With that, let's get started. The game of chicken. First, let's define the game of chicken. The potato example was a good one, but now I'm going to use a more classic example of a chicken race. In the movie Footloose, there's a scene where two people drive tractors at each other, and the first one to swerve is called the chicken. Imagine you're involved in a race like this. What do you hope would happen? Best case scenario, you get the other guy to swerve when you don't, and you get bragging rights and cheers from all your friends. Second best, you both swerve and it's a tie. Third best, you swerve and get called a chicken. And worst of all, neither of you swerve and you crash violently. This pattern defines the game of chicken. Both players prefer to have the other guy give in first, but if neither one gives in, then it'll be a disaster for everyone. In the last episode, I used the example of roommates doing dishes to illustrate the prisoner's dilemma. I was wrong. It's actually an example of the game of chicken. I would prefer someone else does the dishes so I don't have to spend my time and energy on them. After that, I would prefer that we share the responsibility. After that, I would prefer to do all the dishes myself. And leaving a big pile of dishes in the sink indefinitely is the worst possible outcome for me. It's a situation that makes you wonder, who's going to give in first, Mark or his roommates? So it's a game of chicken. If no one gives in, it becomes a dishes disaster, and in hindsight, you wish you would have just done them all yourself. Hopefully with that, it's clear how the game is set up, and we can move on to talking strategy. Strategic moves. If you ever find yourself in a game of chicken, what's the best strategy to win? Pretend it's something that you really, really want on the line, like world peace or $20, and you only get it if you make the other guy swerve before you do. To win, you need to convince the other guy that you're not going to swerve no matter what. And a great way to do that is to take a wrench and a screwdriver, unscrew the steering wheel, and toss it out the window. That way the other guy knows for sure that you aren't going to swerve, so they'll be forced to. Tossing away the steering wheel changes the game. It turns it into a new game where you're no longer a player, but you'll get what you want anyway if the other guy behaves rationally. When you do something that changes the game in this way, your action is called a strategic move. If you don't like the game you're playing, you can perform a strategic move to change it into a different game. Here's another example. You go to sleep at night with the intention of getting up early in the morning, but you're playing a game against your future self, who would prefer to sleep in. Your future self is the one who actually decides whether or not to get up, so how can your current self change the game in a way that will make your future self get up? You could set an alarm, but that might not be enough. Your future self can just turn the alarm off and sleep in. So you perform a strategic move and buy one of those alarm clocks on wheels that as soon as it goes off, it runs away and you have to chase it down to make it stop ringing. Your future self might hate you for it, but you've successfully changed the game to force them to wake up. Strategic moves that commit you to a course of action are called commitment devices, which includes things like hostages, collateral, and contracts. Medieval kings would marry their children off to the nobles of a neighboring country, because it showed they're committed to not going to war against that country. Another commitment device is leaving your wedding ring at a pawn shop to get a loan. You only get the ring back if you repay the loan within a time limit. And a third example is when you sign a contract, and if you don't do your part, you have consequences imposed by the government. Commitment devices limit your options, but they can also make it so that other people are incentivized or even forced to work towards your goals. Here are a couple more examples. A general who fights with his back against a cliff so that his soldiers don't have the option to retreat will have soldiers who fight more fiercely. Cortez, when he landed in Mexico with his troops, ordered his ships to be burned so that his soldiers would be forced to either conquer or die. And sometimes people who really want to meet a goal, such as giving up smoking, will set up a hostage situation where they arrange to have a third party donate a large sum of money to a cause they absolutely despise, like the opposing political party, if they don't meet their goals. These are all commitment devices to change the game that your future self gets to play. They may seem overly brutal. That's probably because they are overly brutal for most purposes. I can't recommend burning your ships or setting up a hostage situation in general unless you've thought about it carefully and really have no other choice. But yeah, strategic moves change the game in your favor, and a specific type of strategic move called a commitment device is a way to limit your options to convince other people that you really aren't going to give in. That's one strategy for winning at the game of chicken, by changing it into another game. Now let's look at a different one. Brinkmanship. Say you're in charge of a country, and you really want to stop a different country from sending hot air balloons full of garbage and poop across the border. Real story happening between North and South Korea right now. You ask them kindly to stop, but they don't listen. You might try to get them to listen by raising the stakes. You could threaten to send your own poop balloons across the border, or threaten to stop trading with them, or even threaten to go to war. But raising the stakes isn't the only way to play. I want to talk about another aspect of the game. Risk. Back to another racing example. In the movie Rebel Without a Cause, there's a different example of a chicken race, but this time both characters drive their cars towards a cliff, and whoever turns first is the chicken. When they do that chicken race, one of the characters gets stuck. His jacket sleeve gets caught on the car door handle, and he can't turn in time, and he ends up driving off the cliff. This isn't how we talked about the game of chicken earlier. This driver would have turned, but he unexpectedly wasn't able to. When you add in the idea that unexpected events like this can happen, a new aspect to the game of chicken emerges. As you get closer and closer to the point of disaster, where the tractors crash, or the bombs get launched, or the cars fall off the cliff, you're also increasing the risk of something unexpectedly triggering that disaster early, like getting your sleeve caught in the car door, or your soldiers misunderstanding their orders and firing without permission. And you can use that increased risk to put pressure on your opponent. This strategy of playing chicken by escalating the risk is called brinkmanship. Brinkmanship is when you deliberately increase the risk of disaster to force your opponent to back down. This only works if your opponent is less risk tolerant than you. The book The Art of Strategy, where I learned much of my game theory knowledge from, uses a scene from a movie called L.A. Confidential to illustrate this point. There's a good cop, bad cop interrogation going on, one with very high stakes. Hot-tempered cop Bud White bursts into the interrogation room with a revolver. He loads a bullet into one of the chambers, then tells the suspect he'll pull the trigger if they don't reveal the location of a kidnapped girl. Neither the suspect nor the officer knows which chamber the bullet is in. White pulls the trigger. The chamber is empty, but it raises the chance that the bullet's in the next chamber. And then he pulls the trigger again until the subject talks. White is threatening the suspect to get him to comply, but the threat is not, "I am going to kill you if you don't tell me." It's, "I am going to pull the trigger if you don't tell me." A much more believable threat. And if the bullet happens to be in that chamber, you will die. It's creating a risk of death. And every time he pulls the trigger, the risk increases. Neither the suspect nor the officer wants the suspect to die, but the officer is more risk tolerant than the suspect, which is why this strategy works and the suspect talks in the end. Here's another example. Nuclear war. No rational person would actually start a nuclear war. That's a worst-case scenario for both sides. To get around this, you could try to convince your opponent that you're totally crazy and can't be considered a rational person. But there's also another option. You can employ brinkmanship and use the possibility of accidentally starting a nuclear war as a bargaining tactic. This strategy was famously used during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where both the United States and the Soviet Union came dangerously close to nuclear conflict. By pushing the situation to the brink of war, both sides dialed up the risk of an accidental nuclear catastrophe. And it almost happened multiple times. In one very worrying case, a Soviet submarine armed with nuclear weapons was deep underwater and out of contact with the situation above. Then some American ships started dropping depth charges to get the submarine to surface. The submarine's captain thought that the war had started, and he wanted to fire a nuclear torpedo. The submarine's political officer agreed. And on any other submarine, that would have been enough to authorize the launch. But by a quirk of fate, this submarine was also carrying Vasily Arkhipov, the chief of staff of the entire brigade, and so this submarine also needed his authorization as well. He said no. He was the lone voice of dissent, but he held his ground and convinced the other two officers to stand down, and in doing so, he possibly averted a nuclear war. It was later said by a Cuban Missile Crisis historian that this was not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history. The Cuban Missile Crisis finally ended with an agreement that the Soviet Union would take its nuclear missiles out of Cuba and the US would remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey, and, importantly, no nuclear missiles were fired by either side. But it was close. If history had gone a little differently, then the tense situation could have become a nuclear disaster. So, that's brinkmanship. The takeaway is that if you think you will blink first, if your tolerance for risk is lower than your opponent, then you should not try brinkmanship. Another takeaway is that if you try brinkmanship, there's always the danger of falling off the brink. Let's all agree that nuclear war is a brink that we should maintain a healthy distance from. Okay, that was pretty intense. I think we need a joke break. What's a chicken's favorite subject? Egonomics. Sorry if you were expecting something better. Game theory puns about chickens don't exactly exist on the internet. Believe me, I've explored it thoroughly. But let's go back to eggs-planing the game of chicken. Brinkmanship isn't the only strategy in the game of chicken. If there isn't a rush for time, you might try salami tactics. Salami tactics are when you get the other person to concede a minor thing, then another, until you get what you want without them ever retaliating against you. This strategy is similar to slicing pieces off a salami. Each slice is small, but over time the whole salami gets eaten. Or like when you tell yourself you only watched YouTube for 5 more minutes, then 5 more, then 5 more, until you realize you should have gone to bed hours ago. This also happens in international politics. This is an oversimplification, but salami tactics are similar to how the Nazis expanded their territory so much in the years leading up to World War II. Hitler wanted to expand, and France and Britain told him to stop or they would go to war. Hitler said, "We're taking this little piece of land, and we promise it's the last one." And Britain and France didn't like it, but it wasn't a big enough deal to start a war over. And then Hitler repeated the same tactic, taking more land, and again promising that this was the last time, for real this time, pinky promise, cross my heart and hope to die. And again, it wasn't a big enough deal to start a war over. This tactic helped them gain the resources they needed to build up their military, which eventually led to World War II. That's an example of salami tactics. And if any of you out there are historians and want to tell me that that's not how it happened at all, please feel free to add a fiery comment to the YouTube version of this episode. The engagement is good for the algorithm. So that's the game of chicken. You can put pressure on your opponent by raising the stakes. Or, instead of raising the stakes, you can increase the risk of accidentally causing a disaster, which is a strategy called brinkmanship. Or, you can get what you want slowly over time using salami tactics. We also talked earlier about how you can use a strategic move, like throwing away the steering wheel, to change the game in your favor. Throwing out the steering wheel is a type of strategic move called a commitment device. It firmly commits you to not swerving. There's also a lesser cousin to a commitment device called a credible signal that I want to talk about next. Instead of throwing away the steering wheel, you could close your eyes, which is a signal that you really don't intend to swerve. It doesn't change the game. Maybe you're really good at judging distances and you're planning to open your eyes at the last moment and swerve out of the way. But it's a believable signal that you're planning on driving straight on through. Next, we're going to shift to talk about signaling, including what makes a signal believable. Signaling. Here's the situation. You're playing the board game Secret Hitler, where players secretly get divided into liberals and fascists, and the fascists try to undermine everyone else. You look at your cards and, phew, you're a liberal this round. So you tell everyone, "Hey guys, I'm a liberal." And they say, "That's exactly what a fascist would say." You told the truth. Why didn't they believe you? Secret Hitler is a game where players have strong incentives to be deceptive, so you can't just trust people to tell the truth. Talk is cheap. In Secret Hitler, a more reliable way to tell liberals from fascists is by analyzing the moves they make, seeing if they pass liberal or fascist legislation. This is a general principle in signaling theory. Actions speak louder than words. Actions leak information, and we can use that fact to avoid being deceived. First, some terminology. When you perform actions to leak information that benefits you, it's called signaling. When you perform actions to reduce unfavorable information leaks, it's called signal jamming. And when someone else puts you in a situation that forces you to reveal information through your actions, it's called screening. We'll look at each of these, but most of the focus will be on signaling. Signaling, leaking information through your actions. First, I'll note that yes, it is possible for actions to be deceptive. People can smile even when they aren't feeling happy. So it's important to know what types of actions are most believable. One way to make a signal believable is to make it a signal that costs you something. For example, if a waiter recommends the most expensive thing on the menu, they might just be trying to raise the tip. But if they point you away from the most expensive items and recommend you something cheaper, it's probably a sign that it's a good recommendation, because it costs them potential tip earnings to recommend it. Except, some waiters are aware of this fact and use it to play head games. They steer you away from the most expensive items to convince you that they have your best interests at heart, in the hope that you'll reciprocate and give them a larger tip after all. They know how to play the bigger game. So a costly signal can sometimes be more believable, but it also might just mean they're playing head games with you. So, even better than a costly signal is a signal that is differentially costly. Someone who's sending an honest signal can afford the price much more easily than someone who's trying to deceive you. Here are 100 different examples of differentially costly signals. The first one is from a potentially traumatizing story in the Bible. Two women both claim to be the mother of a baby, and their neighbors can't tell who's telling the truth. They bring the case to King Solomon to judge. He proposes a shocking solution: cut the baby in half and give one half to each woman. One of the women agrees to this solution and the other doesn't. Solomon judged that the woman who didn't agree was the real mother. That's because Solomon's solution to the problem was differentially costly to each of the women. It would be more emotionally damaging to the real mother than the fake mother, which is how Solomon could tell which one was genuine. Also, I'm sure it traumatized the woman greatly, and she probably never trusted Solomon again after that. Another example of differentially costly signaling is when a car dealership offers a warranty on the car it's trying to sell you. If they offer a warranty, it's a believable signal that the car is in good repair, because selling a warranty on a car that's likely to break down would cost them more money than they would make off of it. Which isn't to say that you should buy the warranty, but the fact that they're offering it is a credible signal that the car is in good repair. Differentially costly signaling also comes up in animal behavior. Sometimes a gazelle will jump high into the air, seemingly for no reason. It's called stotting or pronking, and we think that they do it to signal to any predators that might be watching that they're fit and healthy and not worth pursuing. A gazelle that isn't fit wouldn't be able to jump as high or waste energy like that, and so it's a differentially costly signal. Another example is a peacock's tail. Having such a large tail can potentially make it harder to find food or escape from predators. Only a strong and healthy bird can afford such a large tail, which is why it's a good signal to females of the peacock's fitness. Finally, conspicuous consumption. You buy things you don't need to show that you have surplus money. In an ironic twist, expensive watches often don't keep time as well as cheaper ones, and expensive car brands are known to break down more often than less expensive ones, which actually helps them meet their purpose as a status signal, because only wealthy individuals can afford to maintain them. I also want to talk about how Japanese businessmen will gift each other watermelons worth between $100 and a couple $1,000s. Yes, it is possible to buy a $6,000 watermelon. Spending such a huge amount on a gift is a signal that the giver is wealthy and high status. The fact that it's a watermelon is important because apparently it's not the price of a thing that matters to signal status, but how the price compares to a typical example of the thing. That's not a game theory result, that's a psychology result, but it's still interesting. That's enough examples for now. I promised you to talk about two more things: signal blocking and screening, so here they are. Screening. Many jobs require you to have a college degree, even if it's a degree completely unrelated to what you'll be doing on the job. A big part of this is that college degrees are used as a screening device. The employer would like to know if you'll be a hard worker or a lazy worker. They know that it's easier for a hard worker to get through college than for a lazy worker, and so they require a college degree to help screen out the lazy workers. That's not the only benefit of college. College also teaches important critical thinking skills, but screening is definitely part of it. Now, signal jamming. If you've ever been on a dating site, then you know that they have you create a profile with some pictures and information about yourself. Then, other people will use this information to screen out people they don't want to pursue. When you make a dating profile, it's usually required to have at least one picture of yourself, but you have the option of adding more. Now think about what sort of signal it sends if you choose to only add the minimum number of photos. It might mean you're lazy and only put in a minimal amount of effort on things. Or that you aren't serious about dating right now. Or that you don't like your own appearance and have a hard time finding good photos of yourself. No matter which of these is true, if you want to get more dates, you should consider adding more photos as a way of signal jamming, because those aren't signals you want to send. Similarly, if a dating profile has a place to write your job and you leave that field empty, people will assume that you're unemployed. If you are unemployed, you can try to jam that signal by writing something vague and funny. But it's hard to get that one to work well because other people will probably see right through it. So you're much more likely to get matches on a dating site if you have the maximum number of photos and if you have a real job listed in your profile. Okay, I have one last concept for you to round out our discussion of signaling. It's about a specific type of signaling you can use if you're at the very top and you want to distinguish yourself from the average person. It's called counter-signaling. Steve Jobs, the former CEO of Apple, would famously wear jeans and a t-shirt to work. CEOs typically wear a suit and tie to signal their high status, and jeans and a t-shirt are very much not normal among CEOs. Steve Jobs might have done it partly because he just wanted to be comfortable at work, but another part of it was counter-signaling. He was already so high status that there was no danger of people mistaking him for a grunt worker, so there was no need to send the conventional signal of a suit and tie. And his failure to send the signal became a signal that he was confident in his position and didn't need to prove it through conventional means. That's counter-signaling. Another example is when close friends distinguish themselves from casual friends by insulting each other. If your casual friend insults you, then you'll be insulted. But if your close friend calls you a drunk giraffe high on cough syrup, then you'll know that they're joking. And the fact that they feel like they can get away with such a deep level of teasing differentiates them from casual friends. Finally, counter-signaling can possibly help explain why most people with a PhD don't refer to themselves as doctor. If they're confident in their status, then there's no need to show it off, and so, in general, the only people who expect you to call them doctor are the ones who belong to certain professions that are historically called doctor, like a university professor, or PhD holders who are insecure about their intelligence or social status. Which is to say, this entire episode was a way for me to set up a situation that makes it incredibly ironic for me to say that I just got my PhD, and you must now call me Dr. McDonald. So that was signaling and counter-signaling. Now I want to tie it back to the game of chicken and summarize what we talked about. But first, let's go back to the idea we talked about earlier of throwing away the steering wheel. Throwing away the steering wheel sabotages yourself so that your opponent will be forced to give in to avoid a mutual disaster. But the value isn't really in sabotaging yourself. The value is in convincing the other guy that you've sabotaged yourself. So even better than throwing away the steering wheel would be to throw away a fake steering wheel while keeping the real one. Unless the other guy knows that that's an option, then they might not believe you when you throw the steering wheel out the window. Would it be more convincing if you then threw a second steering wheel out the window? Probably not. So we're back to the age-old question of how do you convince other people that you're serious? And the way to do that is through signaling. Actions speak louder than words, and throwing away the steering wheel is an action that speaks very loudly. But it's possible to perform deceptive actions, like throwing away a fake steering wheel. So it's important to understand what type of actions are the most believable, which is why we talked about signaling. To summarize our discussion of signaling, the most believable actions are actions that are differentially costly, where someone being deceptive has to pay a higher price than someone being honest. This is the idea behind the phrase, put your money where your mouth is. If you invest a lot of resources into the game, then it's a credible signal that you're going to see it through. You should also keep differentially costly signals in mind when you're screening other people for a job or as a potential dating partner, and put them in situations that it's hard to fake. Also be aware that they'll try to jam their signals of things they don't want you to see. Finally, Countersignaling is when people at the top differentiate themselves from the average Joe by not sending an expected signal, like how Steve Jobs would wear jeans to work. To relate it back to the game of chicken, okay, I can't think of an example of countersignaling in the game of chicken, so I'll go with a related idea of having a strong reputation for something. You can regularly win at games of chicken by developing a reputation for never yielding, like the US policy to never negotiate with terrorists. Just like countersignaling, this only works if you're confident in your reputation. Otherwise, it could just lead to mutual disaster. Conclusion. That's it for today. We started out with a guy who played chicken with his girlfriend's parents by pretending not to know what a potato is. In that situation, pride prevented either side from backing down, and it probably led to the boy and the girl breaking up. In the rest of the examples we looked at, it was assumed that each player was rational, and so you can expect one or the other to give in before the worst case scenario happens. But it's important to remember that in the real world, people don't always behave rationally. But, assuming the other person is rational, there are a few different ways to win at the game of chicken. First, you can put pressure on your opponent by raising the stakes. Second, you can put pressure on your opponent by increasing the risk of accidentally causing a mutual disaster, which is a strategy called brinkmanship. Third, you can employ salami tactics to do things in small enough steps to avoid retaliation from your opponent. Fourth, and this was mentioned only briefly, you can develop a reputation of never backing down. And fifth, you can employ a strategic move, such as throwing away the steering wheel, to change the game in your favor. But no matter which of these strategies you use, you need to understand how to send a credible signal that you're not going to give in. The most credible signals are differentially costly. They cost more to fake than to send honestly. And with that, I think we're done. Just like last episode, I'll finish off with a joke that's a little longer than normal. It goes like this. The captain of a battleship spots a light in the distance in the battleship's path. Wanting to avoid a collision, he radios to the source of the light. Change your course 10 degrees to the south. The response is quick. Change your course 10 degrees to the north. His pride slightly damaged, the captain responds, Change your course 10 degrees to the south. I'm in a battleship. Comes the answer, Change your course 10 degrees north. I'm in a lighthouse. So remember, kids, don't try to play chicken with a lighthouse. Thank you for listening, and come back next time for more science. Peace. This has been Ideas Worth Exploring by Mark McDonald.